Triglycerides, the underestimated risk. Fat tolerance test, the future of residual cardiovascular risk diagnosis. If you had a patient with normal LDL, treated with statins or not, and fasting triglyceride levels of 150 to 180 milligrams per DL, would you prescribe a treatment to him? Probably not. This, of course, is more true if you had a patient with fasting triglyceride levels of 90 to 150 milligrams per DL. You definitely would not provide a triglyceride treatment. However, both approaches include an error. And the error is 1. The underestimation of the correlation between triglycerides and atherosclerosis, and 2. The weakness in dynamically measuring triglycerides' actual level. First error. There is the impression that triglycerides, as large molecules, cannot penetrate the blood vessel walls and therefore do not cause atheromatosis. This approach is inaccurate, because as triglycerides increase in blood postprandially as chylomicrons and VLDL, the human system transfers them to LDL and HDL in order to metabolize them. When LDL is saturated with triglycerides, they break down and become small and dense LDL, which do not only promote atherosclerosis, but which are also more toxic. Also, after the dissolution of chylomicrons and triglycerides, triglyceride remnants are created, remaining in plasma, and they penetrate the blood vessels as well as causing atherosclerosic lesions. Conclusion. When triglycerides are increased postprandially, small, dense LDL and triglyceride remnants are created, which are atherogenic. And therefore, triglycerides should be evaluated as an important atherogenic factor. This is confirmed by a number of studies, including the Framingham Heart Study, Copenhagen City Heart Study, Asia-Pacific Cohort Studies Collaboration, Hokanson-Austin meta-analysis in 17 clinical studies, where 46,413 men and 10,864 women participated. Second error. Measuring fasting triglycerides in the morning, we gather wrong information. Because triglyceride levels are rising postprandially. During the day, we eat meals or snacks, each containing 20 to 40 grams of fat. After each meal, triglyceride levels increase. Moreover, if the body does not have time to metabolize the previous meal, triglyceride levels increase even more. Therefore, during the day, triglyceride levels are fluctuating considerably at several levels. Morning measurement is unable to detect the dynamic variation of triglyceride levels during the day. It's something like diabetes mellitus. While a patient has a normal fasting glucose level, a glucose tolerance test is required in order to determine a problem with sugar metabolism. With triglycerides, we have the same diagnostic problem. Because their level fluctuates during the day, proper measurement requires a dynamic test equivalent to the glucose tolerance test. This test is the fat tolerance test, which detects the pathological postprandial triglyceride levels. Studies have found that patients with fasting triglyceride levels of more than 90 milligrams per DL with cardiovascular disease, hypertension, type 2 diabetes mellitus, obesity with a BMI higher than 27.5, metabolic syndrome, but also women after menopause, elderly over 65, and smokers present pathological postprandial triglyceride levels. Therefore, patients who belong to any of the above categories having fasting triglycerides of only 100 milligrams per DL are very likely to have pathological postprandial triglyceride levels, and they are under high cardiovascular risk. These patients, who measure their triglyceride levels only in the morning, remain undiagnosed and therapeutically untreated. It remains to be seen whether early diagnosis of pathological lipemia and subsequently more aggressive treatment will reduce cardiovascular risk. Cardiovascular diseases, CVD, acute myocardial infarction and stroke are the leading causes of death worldwide. 38% of deaths worldwide are due to CVD. The main intervention today in the presence of abnormal lipid levels is the reduction of total and LDL cholesterol levels. The studies have indicated that when high levels of total and LDL cholesterol were reduced by lipid-lowering drugs, cardiovascular mortality and total mortality were decreased by 30 to 40%. This means that most patients, although receiving the best available medical treatment, continue to be at increased residual cardiovascular risk, which renders necessary the diagnosis and reduction of this risk. An important factor included in the residual cardiovascular risk determination are the triglycerides. Until recently, it was suggested that triglycerides are large fat molecules and therefore are not a potential atherogenic factor. This has now proven to be wrong. The increased plasma triglyceride levels are mainly caused by chylomicrons and hepatic-derived very low-density lipoproteins, VLDL. After a fatty meal, fat is absorbed in the intestine and passes into blood in the form of chylomicrons. In normal conditions, chylomicrons and their remnants are rapidly metabolized and removed from the blood circulation via specific receptors. In cases where postprandial hypertriglyceridemia exists, the following happens. Chylomicrons, VLDL, and IDL and their remnants are increased. These structures are rich in triglycerides, and thus plasma triglycerides are increased. As triglycerides are not metabolized normally, and for this reason pathologically high values are detected postprandially, the frequency of exchange of triglycerides of the above structures with esterified cholesterol from HDL and LDL lipoproteins increases. This results in saturation of LDL and HDL with triglycerides and in the eventual formation of new structures, which are converted to small and dense atherogenic LDLs. The small, dense LDLs are more atherogenic than LDLs, and the mechanisms by which this phenomenon occurs are the following. They more easily penetrate the arterial wall, they are toxic for endothelial cells, they cause the production increase of the plasminogen activator inhibitor 1, PI1, and of thromboxane by the endothelial cells. They are oxidized more easily. They are connected more easily with the lipemia of the arterial wall. They are less associated with LDL receptors and more with the scavengers receptors of macrophages. These small, dense LDLs are not taken up by the specific receptors, which are their normal destination, but they are accumulated outside the wall of blood vessels. There, they are oxidized, and therefore oxidized LDL molecules are recognized as toxic by the body. Then macrophage cells are mobilized to cause phagocytosis and destroy oxidized LDL by trying to withdraw them from the blood circulation through receptors that are called scavengers receptors and are found in macrophages. But since there is no natural mechanism to auto-adjust this phagocytosis, the macrophage fills up without any barrier, resulting in the release of free cholesterol in the vessel wall. This fact motivates smooth muscle cells to migrate to contain the damage. They become foam cells and trigger the mechanism of arthrogenesis. Finally, postprandial lipemia increases the levels of triglycerides remnants in plasma, which also have arthromatous activity. The studies that confirm that high levels of triglycerides in plasma are an independent risk factor for cardiovascular diseases are the Framingham Heart Study, the Copenhagen City Heart Study with 14,000 Danish men and women, the Asia-Pacific Cohort Studies Collaboration, and the Hawkinson-Austin meta-analysis in 17 clinical studies where 46,413 men and 10,864 women participated. The above studies led the European Atherosclerosis Society Consensus Panel, the Expert Panel Statement, and the American Heart Association Scientific Statement to the conclusion that the current data is sufficient to confirm that elevated plasma triglyceride levels, fasting and non-fasting, increase the risk of cardiovascular diseases. However, there is a diagnosis gap in triglyceride measurement because the test is carried out while fasting, while the postprandial triglycerides fluctuate several times at different levels during the day. And until today, a dynamic test, for example, blood glucose tolerance test, to reveal the postprandial triglyceride metabolism did not exist, and we measure fasting triglycerides and non-fasting triglycerides. Morning measurement of fasting triglycerides is made after 12 to 14 hours of fasting, and therefore pathogenic postprandial increase in lipids is not recorded, while the non-fasting triglycerides test is made without any preparation, anytime after receiving conventional food within 8 to 14 hours. The results of the test depend on many variables, such as the quantity of the previous meal, the fat content of the previous meal, whether measurement is carried out after the first, second, or third meal, the carbohydrate content of the meal, and the elapsed time since the last meal. Thus, cumulative triglyceride levels in circulation are above fasting triglyceride levels most of the day, since during the day we consume 3 or 4 meals containing 20 to 40 grams of fat each. Furthermore, there is cumulative increase of triglycerides, since the increase of postprandial triglycerides start already at an elevated level from the previous meal or meals. So during the day, blood triglyceride levels are high, which morning measurement cannot diagnose. This fact imposes postprandial triglycerides measurement in order to diagnose pathological levels. The test that measures dynamically postprandial triglyceride levels is the fat tolerance test. What is the fat tolerance test? Measurement of postprandial triglyceride levels after receiving a standard meal, similar to the glucose tolerance test. The value of postprandial triglyceride determination is supported by large clinical studies, among which are the Women's Health Study, the Copenhagen City Heart Study, the Physicians' Health Study, the apolipoprotein-related mortality risk study, the second Norwith Park Heart Study, and the Norwegian study. To standardize the fat tolerance test, specific parameters have to be determined. How long after consumption of a standard meal should the sample for the measurement of triglyceride levels be taken? What should the composition be of the standard meal, and which triglyceride level value is considered pathological? Meta-analysis of 113 studies that took place in this area over the last 20 years and was published in September 2011 demonstrated that 1. The most appropriate time to measure postprandial triglycerides is 4 hours after standard meal intake. 2. The fat tolerance meal should contain 75 grams of saturated fat, 25 grams of carbohydrates, and 10 grams of proteins. 3. The test is positive when triglycerides rate is above 220 milligrams per dl. It shall be noted that studies have found that patients with fasting triglyceride levels above 90 milligrams per dl who have cardiovascular disease, hypertension, type 2 diabetes mellitus, obesity with a BMI above 27.5, metabolic syndrome, but also women after menopause, elderly over 65, and smokers potentially have pathological postprandial triglyceride levels. Therefore, patients from any of the above categories, even having normal fasting triglycerides, are very likely to have pathological postprandial triglycerides and are at high cardiovascular risk. Lipotest meal is the standardized meal for the fat tolerance test. It is approved by EOF, the Greek equivalent of the FDA. It is internationally patented in its commercialized form by the company D. Genomeres Advanced Medical Research, and it is the only meal in the world that can be used to perform the fat tolerance test, which is a dynamic medical examination. The advantages of the Lipotest meal are the following. There is no need for patients' hospitalization, as was necessary until now in the studies. Its composition is absolutely standardized and measurable. Its availability in a standardized meal is the only way to make this examination affordable to the community, as it is practically impossible to produce it in the laboratory or for a patient by himself. The way the meal is prepared, powder in airtight packaging, prevents loss of quantitative and qualitative properties and eliminates the possibility of contamination. Its production and distribution are easy and secure. It is tasty, chocolate-flavored, and can be easily consumed. Mode of preparation and consumption. The Lipotest meal package consists of a 115-gram powder sachet. In a bowl with 150 milliliters of lukewarm water, add the contents of the sachet and stir very well with a hand mixer or whisk until the powder is completely dissolved and forms a homogeneous drink. Then refrigerate until the drink becomes like mousse or a pudding. The next morning, following a 10 to 12-hour fasting, eat the mousse. You can drink as much water, coffee, or tea as you want without any sugar. Any kind of drink or juice containing sugar is forbidden. Exactly 4 hours after the meal consumption, a blood sample should be given for triglyceride blood level measurement. During these 4 hours, you should be relatively calm, avoid exercise and excess fatigue. Preparation for the test. The day before the examination, there is no restriction in diet. It is recommended to avoid alcohol intake. The test is performed in the morning after 10 to 12 hours of fasting. During these hours, consuming food and drinking any kind of liquid are not permitted. Only water, tea, or coffee without sugar is permitted. 4 hours after the meal, blood triglycerides level is measured, and if the rate is above 220 milligrams per DL, then the test is positive. It is not recommended to patients with fasting triglycerides levels above 220 milligrams per DL to perform the oral fat tolerance test. Lipotest meal, the only diagnostic meal which can perform the fat tolerance test globally. Lipotest meal, so simple, so important. D. Genomeres Advanced Medical Research.